Known as one of the greatest European jazz musicians of all time, Romani French guitar player Django Reinhardt began his musical career as a promising, talented player. However, throughout his life, Reinhardt suffered from a permanent deformity and had to survive the Nazi occupation of Paris as a persecuted minority. Despite this, Django Reinhardt broke disability barriers by continuing to play despite his disfigured hand, broke musical barriers by creating his own style of music, and broke political barriers by being a Roma and a jazz musician in Nazi Europe. Jean Reinhardt, better known as Django Reinhardt, was born January 23, 1910, near Lieberchuis, Belgium. Born to a family of Manouche Roma, better known as Gypsies, Django spent his childhood traveling by caravan around Central Europe and North Africa. However, after World War I, his family found themselves spending almost all of their time living in La Zone, an area outside of Paris. Born to a family of entertainers, Django became interested in music early in life. At the age of 7, he started playing the violin, and at age 12, he switched to the banjo guitar. Django would spend hours a day practicing, trying to replicate any melody he could. As a teenager, Django got various gigs playing as an accompanist to accordion players in dance halls of Paris. This accordion set to music Django played at the time was known as musette. However, in 1926, Django's life changed forever when he got his first taste of American jazz music. Django had always had an affinity for improvising music, as was the Romani custom, and often did so out of necessity, as he couldn't read music. This is a bit out of line for the strict traditions of musette, but it was a fundamental characteristic of jazz. According to Michael Dregny, jazz is not only exotic and new, but also represented new freedom to Django. He left behind the strict traditions of musette for the new rhythms and opportunities to play the sounds he heard in his head. In 1928, Django got an offer to tour Europe with the British jazz band leader Jack Hyleton. However, on October 26, 1928, the same day he received the offer from Hyleton, the caravan where Django and his wife lived caught on fire. Although he and his wife made it out alive, Django suffered severe burns all over his body. These burns were especially bad on his left hand, the hand most guitar players use for fretting or fingering the different notes on the instrument. Although Django recovered quite well, and far more than the doctors ever thought he would, he never regained complete range of motion in the last 2 fingers of his left hand. As Michael Dregny writes, his left hand was practically a clawed hook, the back shrunken into a knot of scars. His 2 small fingers were largely paralyzed, the tendons and nerves damaged, the digits a near useless contortion of flesh. In most walks of life, losing the use of 2 fingers is inconvenient, but it's not the end of the world. However, as a guitar player, the loss of those 2 fingers was disastrous, as guitarists usually need all 4 fingers on their left hand to play. Many people thought his guitar career was over, but Django pushed through. During the long months he spent recovering, Django slowly relearned how to play the guitar using only his index finger, his middle finger, and his thumb. This forced him to develop a new technique of playing. Instead of playing horizontally on the guitar, or across the neck the narrow way, Django played vertically, or across the neck the long way. Only having the use of 2 fretting fingers posed a particular challenge to Django when it came to playing chords with more than 2 notes. This was a problem, as the guitarist's typical role in most music at the time was to play chords. Because of this, Django began to play music in his own style, which later became known as gypsy jazz. Influenced by both American jazz and traditional Romani music, this new genre became the first major contribution to the jazz world that originated in Europe. No matter where you were in the world, most jazz music of the early 20th century is based on American jazz. In France in particular, fans expected all jazz music to be played with certain instruments, specifically a drum set and wind instruments like trumpet and trombone. The guitar, if one was present, only played chords and did not play improvised solos over the music like the other instruments. Django's music, however, was different. Django played and recorded with countless bands over his career, but his most well-known group was known as the Quintet du Haut Club de France, or the Quintet of the Hot Club of France. Brought together in 1934 by a group of jazz bands known as the Hot Club of France, this group was typically made up of 3 guitars, a string bass, and a violin. The focus of this ensemble was on string instruments, specifically the guitar, an unheard of thing at the time. This string-based jazz music was quite strange to the general public of the 1930s, and many did not accept it as real jazz. In addition to this, many jazz fans expected all real jazz music to be performed by African American musicians, which Django and his band were not. In fact, France prided itself on its racial equality, as black musicians were not discriminated against, yet musicians of other minority groups did face discrimination, such as Romani people like Django. However, despite their slow start and the barriers stopping their success, Django and the quintet quickly rose in popularity, and by 1937 their records were being played around the world. In addition to the unusual instrumentation of his band, Django played all of his music in a style unique to him. Although he had no formal music training and could not read music, Django had an outstanding ear and could play any melody he heard and make it his own. In addition, Django had a natural gift for improvisation, something that is challenging for many musicians even with training. Charles Delaunay, a friend and promoter of Django's, describes the guitarist's music as the very art of sound, not an arithmetical arrangement of white and black notes, but an edifice in sound based on a magnificent vision which he himself was the only one to experience and which disappeared without a trace. Many of Django's songs were his original compositions, but he also played covers of songs by other artists, yet in his own unique style. While Django was making his fame and fortune in France as a Romani jazz musician, both Romani people and jazz musicians in Germany were facing a very different fate. In 1933, the year before the formation of the Quintet of the Hot Club of France, Adolf Hitler was elected Chancellor of Germany. Hitler dreamed of making Germany better, and in order to do so he wished to rid his country and the world of things he deemed degenerate. As part of his attempts to achieve this, Hitler and his supporters targeted many things, including the Romani people, a group that was already disliked, and jazz, a style of music that was liked. On September 1, 1939, World War II began, and by June 22, 1940, France surrendered to the German army. After this event, northern France, including Paris, was under the rule of Germany, and thus the people were subject to the same regulations surrounding both Romani people and jazz music. Paris, however, was a bit of an exception. German propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels declared that life in the city of Paris should be kept mostly the same as it had always been, largely to create a city that Nazi soldiers could visit to enjoy themselves while on leave. Because of this, jazz musicians were still allowed in Paris, as long as the music they played was submitted to the Germans for approval. Similarly, many Romani musicians, including Django, were allowed to continue living and performing in Paris while their friends and family members were being deported. One major factor that allowed Django to continue living his life as normal was his fame. Despite the boundaries against jazz created by the Nazis, jazz music, especially Django's, became extraordinarily popular during the war. During this period, Django performed with the Nouveau Quintet de Hot Club de France, a slightly modified version of his original ensemble. The music played by this new quintet was slightly different than that of the original group, partially to meet the Nazi standards of acceptable jazz. As a suggestion of his promoter, Charles Delaunay, Django also avoided Nazi suspicion by changing the English names of the American songs he covered to French, to convince the Germans that the songs he played were originally French and not American. For example, the song St. Louis Blues became La Tristesse de Saint Louis, a name that also subtly alluded to the great Louis Armstrong. By far the most popular song that Django recorded during the war was an original tune titled Nuages, or Clouds. Originally released on October 1, 1940, Nuages became an instant hit in France, and by 1946 it had become a jazz standard in the United States, the first European song to ever do so. With its simple melody that was easy to hum, Nuages became a song of hope, a so-called melody of peace that resonated with the suffering of the French people during the war. From Nuages' success, Django earned a lot of money, and he and his family were able to lead comfortable, luxurious lives despite the harsh conditions that most other French people faced. And yet, Django still lived in fear, scared that one day the Nazis would change their mind and come for him. During this period, Django also experimented with new forms of music. In addition to the previously mentioned changes to his quintet, Django began composing works for big bands, or larger ensembles of jazz musicians. He also composed two classical works, a symphony and an organ mass. His inability to read or write music posed a challenge to Django when it came to writing for larger ensembles. To overcome this, he employed clarinet player Gérard Lévesque to transcribe his music. Django would play each part on his guitar, and Lévesque would write it down. After the war, Django continued to play various gigs and to record music. In 1943, he left France to tour in the United States, but he did not achieve his desired success and returned a year and a half later. In the years after his American tour, Django continued to perform in Europe, but things were not the same as before. He struggled to get work, and even when he did get gigs, he was unreliable. At this time, he was discouraged with his music and could go months without playing. In 1951, he moved to a house in the countryside, in the town of Samois-sur-Seine. Here, he spent his days enjoying life, fishing, painting, and playing music. On May 15, 1953, Django suffered a stroke and died. He was only 43 years old. Although he was far from the only jazz guitarist, or the only Romani guitarist, Django Reinhardt became the only one of his contemporaries to achieve lasting fame. Today, he is remembered as the first great jazz guitarist, the creator of gypsy jazz, and the first European jazz musician to influence American jazz. He did all of this despite the many barriers standing in his way, such as the injury to his left hand, the musical standards of the time, and the Nazi occupation of France. Although he never achieved his dreams of worldwide fame during his short lifetime, he left his influence on the world. After his death, Charles Delaunay worked to keep his memory and his music alive. In the time since his death, countless guitarists have learned to play in his style, and today there are jazz festivals all over the world dedicated only to gypsy jazz. He might not be the most well-known name in the jazz world, but it is undeniable that Django Reinhardt left an impact on the world, despite the barriers standing in his way.